the woman they called the Scourge came into the dust with blood in her mouth. It was a ritual old as the cracked earth of the valley, a litany recited not in prayer but in thrown stones and spat curses. Each morning, she walked the single street that ran between two sun-bleached ridges like a scar, and each morning the town met her with its casual cruelty. They said she'd brought the blight that withered the corn and the fever that stole the youngest children, that her silence was a vessel for old evils the land had long tried to forget. Her past was a story they wrote for her, a tapestry of whispers woven from their own fear. She never spoke to deny it. Her stillness was her only shield, a fragile thing against the righteousness of their hate. She had a lean-to of scavenged planks against the canyon wall, a place that offered little shelter from the wind but some from the eyes of the town. Her hands were raw from pulling bitter roots from the ground, her face a mask of dust and endurance. The blood in her mouth this day was from a cut lip, where a merchant's son, emboldened by his father's glare, had thrown a shard of slate. She tasted the iron tang and the grit of the road and kept walking, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon, on nothing at all. She was a ghost they insisted on beating to prove she was real, a wound they kept open to remind themselves they could still feel. Her existence was a question the town answered with violence, and her survival was a defiance she offered without a single word. The sun climbed, a merciless eye in a white sky, baking the silence that followed her retreat. He watched it happen from the shade of the livery stable, a man carved from the same hard land as the mesas that surrounded them. Silas. The name was a low rumble in the town, a story of its own, one of blood debts and a past he'd buried under acres of rock and scrub. He was a presence more than a man, broad-shouldered and quiet, his face a landscape of hard-won lines. He saw the boy throw the slate, saw the dark bloom of red on the woman's mouth, saw the way her shoulders did not flinch. He saw the tight-lipped approval of the other townsfolk, their piety a thin veneer over a core of rank suspicion. He had seen this ritual for weeks, a slow, grinding cruelty that set his teeth on edge. It was not his affair. The world was full of casual savagery, and a man could wear himself to bone trying to right it all. But there was something in her unbroken silence that snagged at him, a resilience that mirrored the tough, gnarled junipers that clung to the cliffs. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent, two drunkards from the mine, their courage fortified by cheap whiskey, decided the daily ritual had not been enough. They cornered her near her hovel, their shadows long and predatory. Silas was walking his horse from the smithy, and he stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. He did not shout. He simply let the iron tethering ring drop to the ground. The clang was as sharp and final as a gunshot in the sudden quiet. The men turned, their bravado curdling as they saw him. He just looked at them, his eyes flat and grey as river stones. They shuffled their feet, mumbled, and melted back toward the saloon. Silas walked to her, the dust muffling his steps. He stopped a few feet away, not looking at her wounds, but at her hands. "Work," he said, his voice rough as unsounded wood. "My place." The journey to his ranch was made in silence, the woman walking a pace behind his horse. The town receded, becoming a smudge of dust and bad memory. The landscape opened up, vast and indifferent, a place of immense quiet and stark beauty. The ranch was not a home but a fortress against the wilderness, a collection of low, solid buildings of stone and dark timber hunkered down in a shallow basin, protected from the worst of the wind. A stone well. A corral. A barn that smelled of hay and leather. It was a place of function, stripped of all sentimentality. He gestured toward a small room off the main living space, barely more than a cell, containing a cot and a wooden crate for a table. "Here," he said. It was not an offer of comfort, but of sanctuary, a different kind of survival. Her life found a new rhythm, one defined not by persecution but by labor. She rose before the sun, the cold air sharp in her lungs. She fetched water, the bucket heavy and solid in her grasp. She mended the fences that snaked across the property, her fingers learning the language of wire and wood. She scrubbed the flagstone floors of the main house until they shone dully in the lamplight, erasing the tracked-in dust of the world, imposing a small, clean order on the chaos. Silas moved around her, a silent partner in the choreography of chores. He never offered praise, never offered thanks. He simply left a plate of food for her on the hearth, more than she had eaten in years. He provided her with sturdy boots to replace her worn-out shoes. His kindness was a practical, unspoken thing, a series of actions that said more than words ever could. She was no longer the scourge. She was a pair of hands, a presence in the quiet, a keeper of the fire. One evening, after the meager meal had been eaten in their customary silence, Silas did not retire to his own room. He laid a long, dark shape on the rough-hewn table between them. A rifle. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, its wood stock worn smooth with use, its steel barrel a cool, menacing grey. She watched him, her hand still in her lap. He produced a small tin of oil and a clean rag, and began to work. His movements were methodical, efficient, a ritual she recognized as a form of respect for the tool. The soft scrape of the cloth, the precise click of the lever action, the faint, clean scent of the oil, these were the only sounds in the room. He disassembled the firing mechanism with a familiarity that spoke of 1,000 such cleanings. He did not speak, did not explain. He simply performed the task in front of her, letting her observe. It was a lesson without words. This object, this instrument of death, was also an instrument of survival. It was a part of this life, as necessary as the well or the axe. After he had reassembled it, he slid it down the table until it rested before her. She looked from the rifle to his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held hers for a long moment. He was not threatening her. He was showing her. He was acknowledging the violence of the world they inhabited and placing a piece of that power within her reach. Her hands, which had known only the texture of earth and cloth and splintered wood, trembled slightly as she reached out and laid a hand on the cold, heavy steel. It was a weight she had never imagined holding, a responsibility she could feel sinking into her bones. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time, it was accompanied by something else, a grim, nascent sense of agency. The seasons turned, marked by the changing angle of the sun and the tenor of the wind. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer empty. It became a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. One morning, she found a tear in the shoulder of his canvas coat, a jagged rip from a thorny branch. While he was out on the range, she took it down from its peg and, with a needle and thread from a small kit he had left on a shelf, she mended it. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of order imposed upon the damage. When he returned, he put on the coat and his fingers brushed over the repair. He paused for a fraction of a second. He said nothing, but that night, a small piece of dried apple, a rare luxury, appeared beside her plate. It was a conversation held in gestures. A deeper crack in the silence came weeks later, during a storm that descended from the mountains without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and freezing rain. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and the barn door, weakened by a rotting hinge, was torn from its moorings. Without a word, they both pulled on their heavy coats and went out into the tempest. The rain was a physical blow, plastering her hair to her skull, but she did not falter. They fought the wind together, wrestling the heavy door back into place, their shoulders pressed together for leverage. In the shrieking gale, he had to shout to be heard. "Bolt!" She saw the iron bolt lying half buried in the mud and scrambled to retrieve it. As she handed it to him, their cold, wet hands touched. It was a brief, functional contact, but it felt like a brand. When they were finally back inside, dripping and shivering by the fire, he looked at her. "Wind sharp," he said, his voice low. "Aye," she replied, the single word feeling momentous, a stone dropped into a deep well. The past does not stay buried. It breathes just under the soil, waiting for the right rain to soften the earth. The foreshadowing of its arrival came first as a rumor, carried by a traveling tinker who stopped at the ranch for water. He spoke of a man named Harker, released from the territorial prison, a name that made Silas's hand still on the harness he was mending. Silas said nothing, just gave the tinker a hard look that cut the conversation short. A week later, a rider was spotted on the far ridge, a lone figure who watched the ranch for a whole afternoon before disappearing as the sun bled across the horizon. Silas saw him too. That night, the silence in the house felt different, taut and thin. He didn't just clean the rifle, he sharpened his skinning knife until the edge was a whisper of light, the rhythmic sheeing of the stone, a new and menacing heartbeat in the small home. Ilara watched him, the fear a familiar coldness in her belly. She knew, with the certainty of someone who has lived her life on the sharp end of violence, that the fragile peace of the ranch was about to be broken. The world was coming for them, and it was coming for the man who had given her shelter. He was a man with a debt, and Harker was the collector. The quiet routines of their life were now imbued with a terrible gravity. Every mended fence, every bucket of water drawn from the well, felt like a preparation for a final stand. The lesson that followed was not one of maintenance, but of use. The next afternoon, Silas took the rifle from its place and led her out to a shallow arroyo behind the barn. He set up 3 empty tins on a rock ledge 100 yards away. They glinted in the harsh sunlight. He handed her the rifle. It felt heavier now, charged with a deadly purpose. "Brace it," he said, his voice flat. "Against your shoulder." Firm, he adjusted her stance, his touch impersonal and quick. "Breathe out as you squeeze. Don't pull." The first time she fired, the recoil was a brutal, shocking force that slammed into her, knocking the breath from her lungs and leaving a deep ache in her shoulder. The shot went wide, kicking up dust far to the left of the targets. The noise was a physical violation, shattering the immense quiet she had come to value. A part of her wanted to drop the weapon and run. But she looked at Silas, at the grim set of his jaw, and she saw the necessity. He did not coddle her. He did not offer encouragement. "Again," he said. And so she did. Again and again, she loaded, aimed, and fired. Her shoulder bloomed with a deep purple bruise. Her ears rang. But slowly, her hands stopped shaking. She learned to control her breathing, to make her body a stable platform for the violence she was about to unleash. She learned to look down the sights and see not just a tin can, but a target. A threat. With her 4th shot, a can jumped from the ledge with a satisfying clang. She did not smile. She simply reloaded. She was no longer just the woman who endured. She was becoming a woman who could defend. They arrived on a Tuesday, when the sun was at its apex, bleaching all color from the sky. 3 riders, emerging from the heat haze on the horizon. They did not rush. Their approach was slow, deliberate, an act of supreme and terrifying confidence. They stopped 20 yards from the house. The man in the middle was Harker. He was thin and wiry, with a face like a dried-out riverbed and eyes that held a dead, reptilian coldness. He dismounted, his movements fluid. Silas was already on the porch, his own rifle held loosely in one hand. Ilara stood in the shadows of the doorway, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Silas," Harker's voice was like sand scouring rock. "Been a long time." Silas said nothing. "I believe you have something of mine," Harker continued, a cruel smile touching his lips. 10 years' worth. "Interest accrues, nothing here is yours," Silas said, his voice a low growl. Harker's gaze drifted past Silas, landing on Ilara in the doorway. He looked her up and down with dismissive contempt. "Got yourself astray. Always had a soft spot for broken things, didn't you?" He took a step forward. "The debt, Silas. The gold you left me to answer for, the gold is gone. So are the years." "Leave," Silas said. Harker laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I think not." He nodded to the men beside him. "The house first." Then him. The world, which had been stretched taut with tension, finally snapped. The eruption was instant and absolute. The slow burn of weeks of waiting combusted into a chaos of noise and motion. One of Harker's men raised his pistol, but Silas was faster. His rifle cracked once, the sound a physical blow, and the man was thrown from his saddle. The second man fired, his bullet splintering the porch post near Silas's head. Silas dropped to one knee, levering another round into the chamber. From the doorway, Ilara raised the rifle Silas had taught her to use. Her hands were slick with sweat, the world narrowed to the V-sight and the figure of the second gunman. The memory of thrown stones, of spat curses, of the blood in her mouth, it all coalesced into a single, cold point of fury. She breathed out and she squeezed the trigger. The kick was still a shock, but this time she was ready for it. The gunman cried out, clutching a shattered shoulder as he tumbled to the ground. Now it was just Harker. He moved with a snake's speed, diving behind the water trough as Silas fired. The fight became a deadly geometry of cover and angles. Gunshots echoed off the stone walls of the house. A bullet ripped through the fleshy part of Silas's arm, and he grunted in pain, his return fire going wide. Harker saw his chance. He broke from cover, not for Silas, but for the house, for what he perceived as the weaker threat. He charged toward the porch, a long knife appearing in his hand, his face a mask of predatory glee. Silas was pinned, struggling to reload with his wounded arm. The final confrontation belonged to her. Harker stormed onto the porch, his eyes locked on Elara, a feral grin on his face. "Now it's just you and me, little mouse," he hissed, the knife held low and ready. The rifle was empty. She had no time to reload. There was no thought, only a deep, primal instinct for survival that had been honed through years of quiet suffering. She backed away into the main room, her eyes never leaving his. He followed, confident, savoring the moment. Her heel hit the stone hearth. Her hand, moving on its own, closed around the one thing she had touched every single day, the one thing she had used to impose her will upon this place. The iron fire poker. It was heavy, solid, an extension of her own hardened resolve. Harker lunged. She did not scream. She met his charge, swinging the poker in a flat, brutal arc. The iron met his wrist with a sickening crack, and the knife clattered to the floor. He howled, more in surprise than pain, and stumbled back. She did not hesitate. She swung again, this time for his head, putting all her weight, all her history, all the silent fury of the scourge into the blow. The impact was a dull, final thud. He fell and did not move again. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She stood over him, the poker still gripped in her white-knuckled hand, her chest heaving. She looked down at the man who had brought the world's violence to her door, and felt nothing. Not triumph, not remorse. Just a vast, hollow quiet. She dropped the poker. It rang once against the stone. Outside, Silas was on his feet, holding his arm, his face grim. Their eyes met across the space of the dead. There were no words. There was nothing left to say. Later, under the cold light of the stars, she helped him dig the graves. They worked in silence, two solitary figures reshaping the land, burying the past once more. When the sun rose, casting long shadows from the fresh mounds of earth, she stood on the porch alone, watching the light reclaim the valley. The air was clean. The quiet was hers. It was not peace. It was not happiness. It was the sober, unadorned stillness she had earned.